Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk with immigration attorney Brian D. Lerner. In this particular episode, I would like to talk about adjustment of status, what it means, how you might qualify, what the designation is, and so forth. And maybe afterwards you'll be in a little better position to know when you're possibly eligible to adjust status and what exactly might be the procedures that you would follow in that regard. Now, let me just tell you first by defining what adjustment of status is. Now, adjustment of status is really just a definition of what the individual words in the term means. Adjustment is to change of status. So you're basically you're here in the United States either illegally or legally, depending on the situation, and your status will be adjusted to that of a lawful permanent resident. That's the bottom line. That's what adjustment of status is. So first things first, if you're not inside the United States, you cannot adjust your status. It's impossible because you have no status in the United States. Whether it's legal or illegal, it can't be adjusted if you're not here. So when you're outside the country, when you're overseas at another consulate, there's certain other terms that would apply to you as far as trying to obtain status. But when you want to adjust status, you are in the U.S. So the first avenue you want to do when determining whether you qualify to adjust status is to see if there is some basis in which to adjust. So usually somebody comes into my office and I will first find out if they're here legally or illegally. Because for the most part, one cannot adjust status in the U.S. To that of a lawful permanent resident if they are not legal. Now there's of course exceptions to that, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. But at first blush, you have to look and see what the status is. So let's start off and say that they're in legal status, okay? You're here on an H-1B visa, or you're here on a visitor visa, whatever it is. And you want to apply for the green card. Well, first of all, just applying for the green card itself doesn't mean that you can immediately adjust your status. Let me give an example. Let's say your U.S. citizen brother from the Philippines, filed a petition for you. Let's just say that you entered 2 months ago on a visitor visa to go visit Disneyland, and now your brother wants to file a petition for you to become a resident. Well, the mere filing of a fourth preference petition, especially from the Philippines, will basically have a wait of 22 years. So you're not going to be able to adjust your status based upon that petition 2 months after you enter the U.S. and after he files it. It doesn't matter that he files it, and let's just pretend he files it on Monday and Tuesday it's approved. All that means is that the petition has been approved, showing that he's a U.S. citizen, you are his sister or brother, whatever it is, and that you have sufficiently proven both of you are who you say you are. Then becomes the wait. You get in line and you wait for the visa to become current. And depending what preference you are will depend on how long you wait. So if you're in status, you need to remain in status during the pendency of waiting for the petition to become current. And there's lots of different variations to this. Let's just say, for example, you're here on an H-1B work visa. You've been on there for 5 years, and let's say a year and a half ago, somebody petitioned you, let's say a company petitioned you for a perm. Okay, what this means is that on an employment-based petition, they submitted a petition on your behalf, and again, you're going to have to wait. But let's say that you're from India. Okay, they have a very long wait for EB3 perm preference petitions for perms. And so let's say the wait is 5, 6 years, whatever it is. Well, if you're here on H-1B, there's a rule that if you have a perm pending for at least 365 days, then you can renew the H-1B year after year after year until it becomes current. So that way you can maintain your status so that once the employment petition is current, you can adjust status to become a lawful permanent resident. There's all kinds of ways of trying to work the situation. I mean, let's say that you're being petitioned, or you were petitioned many years ago by a lawful permanent resident parent, okay? And let's just say that the visa waiting is 7 years. Well, if you came here, let's say, for example, on a B2, which is a visitor, you could switch to F1B, which is student. You could go to student for four years. You might get your master's. You could go many, many years as a student, and then you can apply for an H1B or an O1, depending. And ultimately, when the visa number becomes current, then you can adjust status and become a lawful permanent resident. So, given that, there's different ways, whether it's employment-based or whether it's family-based, in which to obtain lawful permanent residency and to adjust status in the U.S. You can also adjust through different means, such as the battered spouse petition, ones that are self-petitioning. You can do an investment EB-5. You could do the multinational manager. There's all different kinds of ways, and I can't go over all of them right now. But there's what I'm trying to convey is that there are procedures, if you're here in the U.S., to try to maintain your lawful status for years while a visa number is becoming current. And to further play the game here, many times you cannot apply for a non-immigrant visa, such as an O1, extraordinary ability, or an F1 student, if you have immigrant intent. So, in those cases, you of course would want to apply for the F1 or the O1, whatever it is, and get that approved prior to having some family member or some employer petition you for lawful permanent residency, because that way, that it would, of course, be much more difficult to show that you did not have non-immigrant intent at the time you filed the petition. So if it's done properly, there are many different ways that you could stay here. Now, there's also the asylum-based way of obtaining residency and adjusting status, and this gets into our discussion of, when can you adjust status if you are here illegally, okay? Well, there are times where you're being persecuted in your home country, whatever the reason is, and you come here to the United States. Sometimes you come here illegally, sometimes you come here legally, but within 1 year after entry you can apply for asylum. And let's say that if you come here illegally, when you're applying for asylum, of course that'll be through the immigration court, and if you win, you've been out of status for all the time that you've been in court. But if you win the asylum, then a year later you can adjust status to obtain lawful permanent residency. If you have come to the U.S. legally, let's say on a visitor visa, and 3 days later you apply for asylum, which is doable, you will of course be out of status at the time that your asylum would be granted, most likely, and again you're able to adjust status if granted 1 year after the grant of asylum. Okay, and then there's another ground, which I have a whole other video on this. It's 245I. But for purposes of this video and adjusting status definitions, basically if you had an employer-based or a family-based petition filed prior to April 30th of 2001, and you were physically present in the U.S. on December 20th, 2000, or if you had an employer-based or family-based petition filed prior to January 1498, then physical presence at any time would not be required. Then, as long as you're here legally, I mean, as long as you're here in the U.S., not legally. Obviously, if you're under 240, if you're here illegally, that would be the reason to adjust under 245I. So in that particular case, if you happen to be here, when the visa number becomes current, you pay the $1,000 penalty to immigration, and then you can adjust status. You also have to look, and I always do this when clients come in. I try to put my fingers out and see where the possibilities might be. But if you're a derivative of a 245I applicant, if your mom or your dad filed 245I, or your spouse has some 245I derivative eligibility, then you also might be able to adjust status, even though you have no legal status now once a visa number would become current. And then there's the marriage to a U.S. citizen. Again, I have a whole nother video just specifically on this subject, but basically, if you entered the country legally, other than as a crewman, and you fall madly in love with a U.S. citizen, well then, assuming you haven't been put in deportation proceedings, you would then be able to adjust status to that of a lawful permanent resident, because the U.S. laws find it so important to be together with what they refer to as an immediate relative, that they allow you to adjust status even though you are here illegally. The only key is that you had to have entered legally, and that's the same thing if you happen to be the parent of a U.S. citizen over 21. Again, if you happen to have come here legally, but you've been out of status for multiple years, and your son or daughter is over 21 years old and a U.S. citizen, well then you can also adjust status to that as a lawful permanent resident. And then what other situations exist where you're here illegally, but you can still adjust status? Well, there's I mentioned earlier, the battered spouse petition. The battered spouse petition, whether it's through mental, severe emotional abuse or physical abuse, and it could be either the male or the female. The majority of VAWA, or battered spouse petitions, of course, are filed by females, but there certainly are successful cases filed by the husband as well, and those can go. And also, VAWA applies to children in certain circumstances. There's other cases such as the U visa. You could be here out of status. You could even have a deportation order. You file the U visa. If that gets approved, then 3 years later, even though you're out of status, you can apply for lawful permanent residency and get whatever waivers you need as well. Now let's say that you're in removal proceedings, okay? They're trying to deport you. Well, there's different ways of adjusting status as well. You might also be able to apply for what's called cancellation of removal for non-permanent residents. Or if you happen to have actually had your green card and committed a crime, then you can do cancellation of removal for lawful permanent residents. And the net effect of that, especially the one cancellation of removal for non-permanent residents, is you're adjusting your status in court by having the removal canceled. So that's a different way as well. So there's all kinds of different ways, and just because you might be able to apply in removal proceedings, you also might be able to apply if you're not in removal proceedings, depending on the relief. So for example, another one is registry, okay, which year after year becomes more and more hard to get registry, because you had to come into the U.S. Prior to January 1st, 1972. But assuming that you did, and you've been here all these years, again, it's sort of a self-petition. You self-petition yourself under registry, and if approved, then you would get lawful permanent residency based upon the registry. So there's, as you can see, there's all different kinds of relief that would be available, whether you're here legally or illegally, to be able to adjust status. I've gone over a few of them. There's actually more that exist. but I want to give you a flavor for the types that are available, and that, not every case, of course, you can adjust status, but normally what I do is, if you can't, then I find a way that possibly you can do waivers and possible consulate processing to come in without too much of a problem. So if you want to determine or see if you qualify for adjusting status to that of a lawful permanent resident, go ahead and give me a call or email me. I'll be happy to help and give you the initial consultation's free unless you want a priority consultation, which basically you get a longer time, quicker for a consultation. But either way, let me know and I'll be happy to help, and we'll have more on the coming videos.